great to be with you and bring you greetings from my home state, a real true southern state, South Dakota. But we've been here for almost 30 years now, and they're letting me teach classes and preach sermons generally without having an interpreter present. So I guess things are working out well. My wife is from North Dakota, so it's a little harder for her to adjust. But anyway, just a real pleasure to be with you. I'll tell you, think about the heat here. They're talking about a heat index of 105. I don't think it felt quite like that today, but that's what they were predicting. But it reminds me of a couple from up in North Dakota that decided in the cold of the winter up there, 30 below, that they were going to come down to the Gulf Shores and have a nice vacation. So they booked this real luxury resort there at the Gulf, and the day before they were to come down, the wife got a notice that she had to go to a business meeting the next day. Since they already had the tickets and everything, they decided the husband would fly down and she would come down the next day and join him. So he checked into this beautiful motel, and first thing he did was to send an email to his wife. And anyway, he got one digit wrong in the email address, and so instead it went to the widow of a Lutheran pastor in South Dakota who had just died the day before. And she read the email and shrieked and fainted. Because here's what it said. It said, "Dearest wife, just checked in. Everything's set for your arrival tomorrow. Eternally yours, your faithful husband. P.S. Sure is hot down here." Anyway, my hot down here, yes, but warm hearts as well. Speaking about heat, you know, we also have drought problems sometimes down here, and I remember hearing about a drought that was so dry that the Baptists had started sprinkling. The Methodists were using a wet cloth. The Presbyterians were issuing rain checks. And the Catholics were trying to turn wine into water. But talking about monuments, I'm thinking back to the War of Northern Aggression. And I could be talking about the War of Northern Aggression that we're familiar with here, or I could be talking about the War of Northern Aggression in Vietnam that some of us served in the defense of. Or I could be speaking about the one I'm talking about right now. That's the War of Northern Aggression in Korea. And one thing that happened in Korea, this probably isn't new, but it seemed like it was much more systematic than in previous wars, was that the North Koreans engaged in brainwashing of American and South Korean prisoners of war. And as they did so, basically they were trying to teach our American soldier POWs the modern politically correct view of history. In fact, it's interesting, what they were telling our prisoners there in the early 1950s and what's being taught on college campuses and in many times public schools today was pretty much the same thing. That American history has just been the oppression of the poor by the rich, and American foreign policy has just been brutalizing other nations and so on. And some of our soldiers bought that. But they found that there were two types of soldiers that were almost impossible to brainwash. One was those who had a strong Christian faith and those who knew American history. And today we are seeing a war on Christianity and a war on history, the two things that have been the bulwark of our stability in the past. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the war on monuments, and as part of the war on history. This isn't really anything new. Conquerors have tried to rewrite history over and over again. We saw when the Spanish conquistadors came in that they looked to the writings of the Aztecs, which they considered, perhaps correctly, to be formulas for devil worship, and so they destroyed most of their writings. which unfortunately deprives us of a good deal of history, but the Aztecs, when they had come in several hundred years earlier, they destroyed the writings of the Toltecs. And that just seems to be a common practice throughout history. It seems like if we can destroy the writings of the past, we can recreate a history. And we can recreate a history and use that to create a vision for the future that is far different from what it would be if people knew what history really was. And so in the modern era, we are seeing a war on history. First, they're coming for the Confederates. We seem to be on the first line of defense on this, but we're not alone. Next, they're coming for Columbus, and Columbus is regarded as a conqueror and taking on these poor defenseless Aztecs who did nothing but commit a Holocaust, sacrificing thousands upon thousands of human victims. Next, they're after Washington and Jefferson. This past week, I was up in Nebraska and giving a Independence Day address at a city in Nebraska. What was the name of that town? Oh, yes, Lincoln. But, oh well. They didn't know any better. But anyway, and then one in Sioux City as well, stopped to visit the Floyd Monument there. Anybody know what the Floyd Monument in Sioux City is? It's an obelisk that has been set up to commemorate Sergeant Charles Floyd. Sergeant Floyd was the only member of the Lewis and Clark expedition to die. He died of what was probably appendicitis, and they're saying today that if that's the case, that even if he didn't back up home in the East, they still wouldn't be able to do anything for him, but he was the only member of the expedition to die. Anyway, I suggested maybe the next thing is they'll want to tear down the Floyd Monument because it's devoted to Sergeant Floyd, who was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which was commissioned by Jefferson, who we've just recently discovered was evil. But how far is this going to go? Are they going to go after some of the moderates and the leaders of the movement for equality for blacks? Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, will be going after those next? Or if the political whims should turn the other way, are they going to move the other direction and maybe go after monuments to liberals? What's next? And then we have also the war on the cross, the war on Christianity. Fact of the matter is, the cross is the most censored symbol in America today. And we've had a case before the Supreme Court that I'm pleased to say was decided in our favor just a few weeks ago. Case involving the Bladensburg Cross in Maryland, there at Prince George's, or I believe it was Prince George's County, shortly after World War I. Parents decided to build a monument to commemorate 49 soldiers from Prince George's County who had died in World War I. The monument was about 40 feet tall. I hear some accounts saying 34, others saying 40. So whether you count the pedestal, it was about 6 feet. But anyway, it was dedicated in 1925 and continues to stand. But a few years ago, the American Humanist Association filed a lawsuit demanding that because this cross is a Christian symbol, it has to be removed. The American Legion, which had had a role in the dedication and establishment of the monument, came to its defense. And so the case was titled American Legion versus American Humanist Association. And the Foundation for Moral Law, I'm pleased to say, filed an amicus brief in support of the Legion and in support of the cross. Part of what I argued in that brief was that, first of all, well, the cross is a Christian symbol. Well, it signifies the Christ who died on the cross for our sins. It also has a unique identification throughout American history. Columbus planting a cross there on the island that he named San Salvador, or Holy Savior. We think that was probably Watling Island off the coast of Florida. Or the Jamestown settlers, as they landed, they establish a cross and hold a worship service thanking God for their safe passage. Throughout history like this, we've seen the cross associated with discovery, associated with claiming territory, but thanking God for what he has done for us. Not only that, I argued, but the cross also has a special identification with the military. Outside of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the second highest award that is given in the Army is the Distinguished Service Cross, or for other branches, the Air Force Cross, or the Navy Cross for the Navy or Marines. And the reason for this, you look to the crosses that you see in national cemeteries, you'll see in foreign national cemeteries, that is, those which are owned in perpetuity by the United States, even though they're in foreign countries, you see the rows upon rows of crosses there. In Arlington and in national cemeteries in the United States, by regulation, you have the plain slab, but there'll be a marker on the slab, and in the vast majority of them, that is a cross. And in the older parts of Arlington Cemetery, you will see large crosses of many different styles, Celtic crosses, Latin crosses, and those of other varieties and so on. So the cross has an identification with the military. As Douglas MacArthur said in his farewell address there at Arlington, the soldier, above all other people, is required to practice that highest act of religious training, sacrifice. And as Jesus said, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. One of the things that I wanted to say and did not say in the brief, maybe I should have, probably not, was that actually what the American Humanist Association wanted to do was to take down the cross and replace it with a 40-foot statue of Count Dracula. Because like the American Humanist Association, Count Dracula recoils at the sight of the cross. But I didn't put that in the brief. Well, I guess I didn't have to actually. I'm pleased to say that the Supreme Court made its decision on this case several weeks ago, and they decided in favor of the cross. I was expecting that they wouldn't. I had predicted that they would, and I seldom predict Supreme Court decisions, because when I do, I'm wrong about 50% of the time. But in this case, I was surprised at how strong the ruling was. That if you include all the concurring opinions, it was actually a 7-2 decision that the cross should remain. Hopefully that is going to be a landmark that will shape the direction of state-church relations, particularly in regard to religious symbols in public, for some time to come. But now we have another issue concerning monuments here in Alabama. And I'm not just talking about people taking hot shots at the flag there on I-65, although that's an issue too. And I would say if some talk show host has encouraged vandalism, he could be civilly and criminally liable if any vandalism does take place. So we'll remember what he said, who said it, and when it was. But after we've been seeing this movement in other parts of the country to see monuments removed, not just Confederate monuments, the Alabama legislature in 2017 adopted the Alabama Monument Preservation Act. This is an act that the governor signed into law, and the act provides that any monument that is between 20 and 40 years old cannot be moved or destroyed without the permission of a historical commission. And any monument more than 40 years old cannot be removed at all. That's one of the reasons why the demonstrations that we've seen in Charlottesville and University of North Carolina and other places like this, we haven't seen any of that here. Part of the reason is they know it's not going to get them anywhere, because it has to be the commission to remove a monument if it's less than 40 years old, and if it's more than 40 years old, by law, it can't be removed at all. Now, this law, though, is being challenged today. And the city of Birmingham decided that they wanted to remove a 52-foot obelisk in a park downtown Birmingham that is dedicated to Confederate soldiers and sailors. And the mayor of Birmingham erected some plywood barriers around the base of this monument. So even though they couldn't entirely block the obelisk, people can't read the inscriptions and know what it's about. Well, Steve Marshall, the Alabama Attorney General, sued the city of Birmingham under the Alabama Monument Preservation Act and said that it's a violation of this act to do what they have done. And then, I believe it was last January, a Birmingham judge, Judge Graffio, on his last day of office issued an opinion that really read more like a political harangue than like a legal opinion. But he said that the Alabama Monument Preservation Act is unconstitutional because it violates the city's right to free speech. Now, just quickly, I'm not going to talk about that issue at great length, except to say that although corporations, private corporations, do have some measure of free speech, not to the same extent that private individuals do, the idea that municipalities, who have to represent everybody in the city, that the free speech clause of the First Amendment protects a municipality, that is a, I'll just say, very dubious proposition in law. But anyway, the mayor of Birmingham, Mayor Bell, had said this is a monument to segregation. It's a monument to human bondage. It's a monument to sedition and the breakup of the United States of America. And that's a good share of what Judge Graffio said in his opinion, taking a few elements of history that basically I think he gleaned out of an amicus brief filed by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and at least it seemed like it came out of there. They were very similar. And essentially it reads like a political harangue. Now, when we look to the causes of the war itself, first of all, it is not the place of the court to draw a conclusion as to what the causes of the war were. And I'll simply say in regard to the cause of the war that when you try to determine that, you can get into quite a battle of dueling quotations. You can have plenty of Southerners who are quoted as saying that it is to preserve slavery, plenty of Northerners who say it has nothing to do with slavery, plenty of Northerners who will say it was about saving the Union, plenty of Southerners who will say it was about preserving states' rights, others who will say that it was about tariff issues and about religious differences, Northern Unitarianism versus Southern Calvinism and the like, and many, many other issues that can come in at all. Was slavery an issue of the war? Yes, I'd have to say it was. Was it the only issue? Absolutely not. Was it a major issue? Probably. Was it the major issue? That would depend on what region of the country you're in, who you're talking to, and what the individual person at the time might think. What was the major issue in New England may not have been the major issue in Illinois. And what was the major issue at the beginning of the war may not have been the major issue as the war moved on. It does seem that as the war moved on, Lincoln needed more of a moral cause and began to stress the slavery issue more than he had before. So there were quite a few issues here, but regardless of that, that is not what the purpose of the act is, and it's really not the place of a judge in a legal opinion to rule on what the causes of the war were. Now, one thing the Southern Poverty Law Association tried to do in their brief is to equate the monument with slavery. And they went through some history, some very skewed history, I might add, to say that when you look to the building of Confederate monuments, you find that they coincide with racist periods of history. For example, you see a wave of monuments being built in the 1890s and the early 1900s up to about 1910, about the time many of the segregation laws were being adopted. And then you see them again, they say, in the 1960s, the civil rights issue and the backlash against the civil rights issue. Well, to the extent that is true, why? First of all, you look to the 1890s and the early 1900s. This is the period of time in which Confederate veterans are dying off. And it's time to start memorializing. Also, it's time when the South is beginning to be a little more prosperous, and being more prosperous is able to afford monuments that they couldn't before. But it's not equated with racism. Interestingly enough, this is about the same period of time that you see monuments to Union soldiers being built in the northern states. And that's not to commemorate racism. Likewise, you look to the 1960s, that is the centennial of the war between the states. And so the fact that they were built during those periods of time really has nothing to do with racism at all. Well, we've seen what the law is here in Alabama. Again, we in the Foundation for Moral Law have filed a brief. I drafted the brief, and some of you may know Jay Hinton. Anybody? Some of you know Jay Hinton here. Well, Jay is a Montgomery attorney. He's a past SCV commander over in Auburn, and Jay is the one that actually did some revising of the brief and the filing of it for us. And the Alabama Supreme Court has put a hold on the law and put a hold on the monument, saying nothing can be done to remove it until they decide it. And again, I am of the opinion that they are going to uphold this monument, and they're going to reverse Judge Graffio, and they're going to say that the statute is constitutional. Regardless of any state's interest here in free speech, the idea that a city has free speech, the state has an interest in preserving monuments. And among the interests that we've cited in our brief are, first of all, it shows people how to understand our nation and our state and how they came into being. It helps people to understand the nature of our laws, our customs, and our governmental institutions. It helps people understand and honor the sacrifices made for our freedoms and our way of life. It helps shape our identity as a state and nation. It develops critical thinking skills as we relate the events and personages of history to movements and ideas. It is valuable economically as a tourist attraction. It inspires people to civic action. It makes them realize that they are part of a bigger picture of ongoing history. It motivates people to serve their state and nation, to sacrifice for it, even their lives for their country, knowing that future generations will remember them, as we now remember soldiers of the past. It encourages people to become civic leaders, seeing the recognition given to leaders of the past. It helps people to understand the mistakes and even evils of the past, and points people toward finding ways to avoid making those mistakes in the future. As someone once said, probably Santayana, although there's some dispute as to who originated this statement, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And it causes people to study with a view toward understanding why others believed and acted as they did. David Hume said, history's chief use is to discover the constant and universal principles of human nature. So those are some of the reasons why we think it is important that the state preserve its monuments of the past. Need to remember especially the older monuments, because many times it's harder to recreate those older monuments. For newer monuments, it's easy to find people who remember their being established and to defend them. The older ones may not have defenders. But there's something else here, and that is that, in a sense, monuments are voices of dissent, especially unpopular monuments. They are a reminder to the politically correct orthodoxy today and to those who accept it without thinking that there was a time when people thought differently, and maybe they should be listened to today. And then also, we recognize those who have sacrificed in the past simply because it is the right thing to do. Amen. It's a moral imperative. I don't know how many of you remember Sophocles' play from about 500 BC, the play Antigone. Well, there in Antigone, there had been a civil war in Greece, and anyway, Antigone, a princess, had two brothers who had fought on opposite sides in the war. And King Creon, whose side won the war, issued a decree that those who fought on his side would be buried with full military honors. Those who fought on the other side would have to lie out there in the field unburied. And Antigone provided both of her brothers with a burial. The one who fought for King Creon and the one who fought against him. When she's brought before King Creon for what she has done, kind of seems like Creon wants to find an excuse to let her off the hook, and suggest maybe she just didn't even know about the order so she could plead ignorance. Creon says, "You knew the order not to do this thing." Antigone, "I knew. Of course I knew. The word was plain." Creon, "And still you dared to overstep these laws?" Antigone says, "For me it was not Zeus who made that order, nor did that justice who lives with the gods below mark out such laws to hold among mankind. Nor did I think your orders so strong that you, a mortal man, could overrun the gods. Not now, nor yesterday, they always live, and no one knows their origin in time. Antigone is saying, there is a higher law, a law higher than any governmental authority that requires that we honor those who have fallen in battle. And she is going to obey that order whether the king likes it or not, and whether the king executes her for it or not. A moral imperative. Anyway, I think the court is going to uphold the law as it is. I base that partly on the fact that the case that the city of Birmingham has presented, I think, is very weak. But I base it also on the fact that we've got a pretty conservative Supreme Court here in Alabama. I think they're going to rule in her favor. Now, one thing else I think we need to remember about monuments, and that's that there is a reason that people want to wipe these monuments out. And that is that they would like to be able to recreate history. And by writing a new view of history, they can write a new view of what the future ought to be. Our nation was founded as a constitutional republic based upon essentially biblical Christian principles. But if they can rewrite all of this, if they can create the myth that our founding fathers were deists and skeptics rather than Christians, then there were a few who would not be Orthodox Christians, but the vast majority were, and even those few would not be deists. In my book, Christianity and the Constitution, I address that at length. But if they can eliminate in the minds of people the idea that we ever did have a Christian consensus in this country, and that our nation was founded on Christian principles, it is all that much easier to create a godless society in the future. Some of you remember the book by George Orwell, 1984. And you recall constantly history is being rewritten in the book. And people are told what to believe based upon changes in events. At one time, one nation that they're dealing with is a bad nation, and so all the history about them is bad. Suddenly our alliances change, so we rewrite the history books so that now we think they're good. And as the Ministry of Truth says in 1984, he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. Think about those words again. He who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. Remember this also. No nation can long survive if it teaches its children to hate their ancestors and be ashamed of their heritage. And nowhere is that happening more than in America. And nowhere in America more than in the American South. We need to stand for our heritage, but standing for a heritage is not enough. You know, Germany had a wonderful heritage. You can look back to the origins of the common law in Germany, in northern Germany, particularly Saxony, where after the defeat of the Romans at Teutoburg Forest, the Germanic or Teutonic common law was preserved for northern Germany and for Scandinavia. And then around 450 AD, when the Angles and Saxons came across to Britain and renamed it Angleland or England, they brought the Anglo-Saxon common law to England, from which it came to the United States. We think of Germany also, and particularly northern Germany, Saxony to be exact, as the birthplace of Luther and the Protestant Reformation. We think of the glorious music that comes out of Germany, Bach and so many others. Some years ago, we had a tour of the Reformation sites in Germany, and we viewed, for example, the Wittenberg Cathedral, where Luther is buried, on to the cathedral where Johann Sebastian Bach is buried in the cathedral, and to listen to the organ music there, you'd think Bach himself was playing it. It was gorgeous. But those churches are almost empty on Sunday mornings today. What has happened in Germany? We need to remember that the same country that gave us the common law, that gave us the Reformation, that gave us the glorious music of Bach and others, also gave us the Third Reich, National Socialism, and the Holocaust. What happened? How could that happen with a heritage like that? The heritage was eroded over a period of years. And in fact, as you look through the 1800s, you wonder, how could a Christian country like Germany adopt National Socialism? We need to remember that by the 1930s, there was very little true Christianity left in Germany. After a century of liberalism with the rationalism of Hegel and the romanticism of Schleiermacher, the Arianism of Schopenhauer, the higher criticism of Wellhausen, the social gospel of Rauschenbusch, the demythologization of Bultmann, and the historical Jesus movement of Schweitzer and others, very little true Christianity was left. Back in 1834, a German writer, Heinrich Heine, wrote a chilling prophecy that 100 years later was fulfilled with amazing accuracy. Here's what Heinrich Heine wrote in those days. He says, Christianity, and that is its greatest merit, has somewhat mitigated the brutal German love of war, but it could not destroy it. Should that subduing talisman, the cross, be shattered, the frenzied madness of the ancient warriors, that insane berserk rage of which Nordic bards have spoken and sung so often, will once more burst into flame. The old stone gods will then rise from long ruins and rub the dust of 1,000 years from their eyes, and Thor will leap to life with his giant hammer and smash the Gothic cathedrals. Thought precedes action, as lightning precedes thunder. When you hear a crashing such as never before been heard in the world's history, then you will know that the German thunderbolt has fallen at last. At that uproar, the eagles of the air will drop dead, and lions in farthest Africa will draw in their tails and slink away. Listen to these words. A play will be performed in Germany which will make the French Revolution look like an innocent idol. A heritage is a wonderful thing, but it is not something to rest upon. It is something to build upon. And I hope we will preserve our heritage, but also build upon it. To build upon it the principles of constitutional government. In fact, I believe in the United States Constitution. I've taught constitutional law for many decades to thousands of students. And as a military officer, I took an oath as many of you did as well, that you would uphold, support, and defend the United States Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I can support the United States Constitution because I believe it was a good formula for sound constitutional, limited, free government. I can support the Confederacy because I believe Jefferson Davis and John C. Calhoun understood the constitutional design of our founding fathers better than did Abraham Lincoln and Daniel Webster.
Amen.
Putting all that together, I hope we will rededicate ourselves to these ideals, and the sons of Confederate veterans, Confederate monuments, everything we are talking about here plays such a role in preserving what America was intended to be, what America should be, what part of America still is, and what it can be if we will work to preserve it. I'd be glad to take some time for questions, discussion, if you have some. In back, sir? Take you first, and then go ahead.
Is there a possibility that Germany's been taken over, run over by the Koran people, the ragheads?
It's coming. It's certainly coming. And it seems, I'd say probably that's happening in France more than in Germany.
England too.
And England too. In fact, in England, there are neighborhoods in England where you will see signs, I'm told this at least, you will see signs, I've seen pictures of it too, signs saying, this neighborhood is governed by Sharia law. And there are proposals in Parliament right now to provide that there will be no appeal to the civil courts from decisions of the Sharia courts. That's not adopted yet, but, and they're a little further down the line than we are, but.
North Carolina just came out with something on the news, I just got it last week from Bob McClellan. He does our Confederate reenactments with jewels and everything down in Detroit. And I talked to him about it, he said that North Carolina has decreed, it made passed some kind of bill that no Sharia law would be allowed in the state of North Carolina. So we need to get that too and find out, get a copy of it.
Okay, now they passed a law like that in Oklahoma, and a federal judge, a liberal Obama-appointed federal judge, struck it down. And on what I thought were really ridiculous grounds, we filed an amicus brief before I think that's the 10th Circuit, if I recall correctly, in support of it when it was appealed. The Munir was named Munir versus something or other. And anyway, the court really didn't address the issues we raised in our brief because they hadn't been raised by the parties at the trial level. I really think that the state attorney general defending that law didn't really understand some of the defenses that were available. But anyway, I'd certainly like to see the issue tried again, and maybe North Carolina will be the place to do it. There was a question in the back also first, and then you'll be next.
Well, this is just curious, the two scenic roads, Lake Bridge, Forest 24, they in the SCV.
So did Mayer and Ginsburg.
Oh,
And-
no.
That would have been my second guess.
Now, Kagan is a liberal justice, but sometimes she has shown some pretty good sense of things. We had a case involving, well, it involved the Hosanna Tabor, a Lutheran church case, and she ruled with the majority in support of the church in that case. And in a concurring opinion, she sided with the monument here in this case. And she is, and then Justice Breyer, the other liberal justice on the court, also sided with the monument. Now, Justice Breyer, I might add, had also been a swing vote on the issue of the Ten Commandments. We had the Ten Commandments issue here in Alabama, but there were some other things involved in that case as well. But I think it was probably the late 1990s, I'd have to check the exact date. On the same day, the Supreme Court announced decisions in two cases involving Ten Commandments displays, one in a courthouse in Kentucky, and the other in front of the Capitol building in Austin, Texas. And by a 5-4 margin, the court said that the display in Kentucky was unconstitutional, but by a 5-4 margin, they said that the display in Texas was constitutional. And 4 justices on each side voted the same way in both cases, but Justice Breyer ruled in favor of the Texas display and against the Kentucky display. He said in Kentucky, the commandments stand alone and seem to be an endorsement of the Christian religion. Now, how that would be, I'm not sure. I remember one time I was asked, in fact, it was when they were dedicating the monument here in Alabama. I was there at the dedication, and I actually had a reporter ask me, how do you think a Jew would feel seeing these commandments? And I said, ask Moses. But anyway, but Justice Breyer said that in the Texas display, he was there with a lot of other displays of all different kinds, and so you wouldn't infer Texas was endorsing the Ten Commandments for that display. Anyway, that's it. So Breyer and Breyer and Kagan both seem to be a little more willing to consider other arguments than Ginsburg and Sotomayor are. And anyway, they may, who knows how long Ginsburg's going to be on the court. I'll just say that she's a fine lady. I wish her a long and happy and healthy retirement, hopefully starting very soon. In fact, here's something really interesting about Ginsburg. Just to show you about how sometimes it's important that we be able to reach across the aisle and meet with, you know what Justice Scalia and his wife would do every New Year's Eve? They would spend every New Year's Eve with Justice Ginsburg and her husband. Hard for me to imagine, but anyway, that just shows something of people reaching across like this. Anyway, Harold?
One final question. When do you see the Birmingham case coming up?
You can't really predict when a court is going to decide a case. I have not heard anything about an oral argument being scheduled. And it may be they'll even waive argument in this case. I would expect there to be a decision on it before the end of the year, but the accurate answer to be that is when the justices feel like it. I'm afraid that's the way it works, but I would expect a decision before the end of the year. One more, okay?
Going back to your synopsis of Ginsburg, do you feel our forefathers may have made a mistake when they did a lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court and not a fairly long duration? Do you feel like that's possibly what's going on today?
Okay, very good question. He's asking, did the founders make a mistake when they provided for, in effect, lifetime appointments for justices? It doesn't say lifetime, actually. It says during good behavior, but for practical purposes, that has meant for life, or at least until they decide they're going to retire. And part of the reason they made that decision was, number one, they felt the courts was going to play a very narrow and limited role. Of the three branches of government, in their view, as Hamilton says in the Federalist Papers, the Supreme Court is the least dangerous branch because its role is going to be limited to interpreting the laws and the Constitution. He says the legislature exercises will, they determine policy. The executive exercises force, they carry out the policy. All the judicial branch does is exercise judgment. A couple things I don't think he anticipated was, number one, how much the view of truth itself would change to where we get to the view today that the Constitution doesn't have to mean what the framers thought it meant. Rather, we have this living Constitution view that the meaning of the Constitution changes with time, which means it changes as judges decide to change it. And I think he also didn't anticipate several other things, like what we call the incorporation doctrine, which gives the court far more authority to get into matters involving state and local affairs and so on. And anyway, so for various reasons, the court has become far more powerful than it was at that time. Back in the 1790s, the Supreme Court would actually meet maybe 6-8 weeks out of the year. And in fact, John Jay, our first Chief Justice, who also was a national president of the American Bible Society, at the same time he was Chief Justice, he was also U.S. Ambassador to England. If you ask him what he did for a living, he'd say, well, I'm Ambassador to England, but then I moonlight a little on the side as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But it was not considered to be that important a post at that time, but it's become so much more powerful. Anyway, another reason is they wanted the justices to be making decisions without being influenced by politics. And that has a good and bad aspect. Goode the man who wrote most of the final draft of the Constitution, said that judges should, insofar as possible, be accountable only to God. Of course, he thought they would be accountable to God, and rather than thinking that they're above God or that they are God, as seems to be the case today. But anyway, you can see the benefit of that. And you certainly wouldn't want a situation where you have a federal judge deciding your case, and he's deciding it based on whether he thinks it's going to affect his chances of getting reelected or reappointed. And if we have a conservative president, he might be likely to decide it in a certain way to get an appointment. We would like judges to be immune from that. But at the same time, we don't want them to be unaccountable as they seem to be today. One of the suggestions I've made on it would be that all federal judges, and that includes Supreme Court justices, should be serving 10-year terms. But then, of course, we have the problem that they be worried about getting reappointed afterwards. So I would add a provision to that saying that they would then not be eligible for any other federal office for the next 5 years. Now, that would take a constitutional amendment, but I think it might be worth considering. And the framers, you know, they were very wise people, and they drafted a fine constitution, but they never thought it was infallible. They never thought it was the Bible. And in fact, George Washington once said that if in the distribution of powers, in the opinion of the people, the distribution is in any particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way the Constitution designates. But then he said, but let there be no change by usurpation. What he's saying here is, go ahead and amend the Constitution if either it's wrong or changing circumstances mean that the change is needed. But don't just reinterpret it with some living Constitution approach, because once you start doing that, then you really have no Constitution at all. Thomas Jefferson said that with that kind of judge, the Constitution is nothing but a ball of wax to be molded however a judge wants to mold it. Okay, any more? Well, I do have some books in back. I encourage you to take a look at them. I enjoy being with you, and I've heard good things about this group, and I certainly see why now. Enjoy being with you. Thank you.
You think that anybody will ever get rewritten Constitution?
A rewritten
You think
Constitution?
somebody will get rewritten?
Well, there are, of course, efforts to have a new constitutional convention.
All right,
That's
at our
another
next
issue.
meeting, let me say, you know, we make an annual contribution to flag preservation.